they'll know.
No, let's have some opening remarks.
Wait, Mom, but we already made a presentation about our plan.
Okay, so say the date today for all of us watching the video. What's the date today? December 30th, 2016. And this is Karson Pollock
I'm not announcing myself, Mom.
with her grandfather, Robert
You
Pollock.
should do the announcing, Mom.
Okay, well, I'm just doing it now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe you can
Mom, you do
give
the
that.
announcing, okay?
I just, yeah, okay, so today is December 30th, 2016, and we are here with Karson Pollock, who is interviewing her grandfather, Robert Pollock, a colonel in the Air Force, and he was a fighter pilot, and we are doing a school report and talking about his life. Go ahead, Karson.
All right. What's the first question?
Where were you born?
Where was I born? In Colorado Springs, Colorado.
What was your childhood like?
It was good. My parents were both hardworking people, and so I lived right on the edge of the mountain range, so I had a fairly normal plus a good growing up, so I thought.
Did you play any sports in high school?
I pretty much played all sports because I was in a small high school, so there were the sports guys, except for basketball. As you can see, I'm not too tall. So I played ice hockey. That was probably my best sport since we had a lot of hockey. I played on the baseball team. I played on the football team. And I tried briefly to run track, but that wasn't me.
Were you a good student?
Yeah, I was a pretty good student. I did really well in math and science and stuff, so I wasn't overly great in high school, but good enough, and I had some good math skills.
What were your favorite things to do as a kid?
I'd say hiking in the mountains with some of my knucklehead buddies, and we'd go up into the hills, and those were the days when nobody monitored where you were. As long as you came home by dinner, you were good, so we had access to the woods, and we could go play hockey anytime we wanted, and go fishing, a little bit of fishing, stuff like that. So,
What is one of your favorite memories or traditions from your childhood?
I don't know about too many traditions. I guess going to my grandparents' house, kind of maybe like yours, on Christmas Eve and stuff like that. My grandmother was quite a woman. She lived to be 99 and 6 months, almost made 100. So she was a sweet woman, and my grandfather died a little earlier, but he was a heck of a guy. So those were kind of traditions that we had, I guess, going to see the grandparents all the time.
Can I ask a question? Where were your grandparents from?
They were both from Kentucky, but originally they were German descent, I would say.
What did you do after high school?
After high school, I had a scholarship to any school in Colorado based upon my dad's work experience primarily and my grades. So I chose to go to Colorado University in Boulder, Colorado, and I was pursuing a degree in aeronautical engineering, but I was trying to keep up with the beer drinking and everything else going on, and engineering was pretty hard in those days. So I decided after a year of that, after watching airplanes, I thought rather than designing them, I might rather like to fly them.
Well, that question kind of answered the next one, which is, did you voluntarily go into the military?
I did, but probably not for the reasons that most people think of, not patriotism. I wanted to be a pilot. Now, it turned out to be a pilot in the Air Force in those days, like it is today, you have to have a college degree. So there was a retired Air Force guy who was a father of some kids I had grown up with, and he suggested, based upon my math skills and stuff, that I go into the regular Air Force and compete for the Air Force Academy. So that's what I did. I signed up for the regular Air Force, went through basic training, and then I got a nomination to the Air Force Academy, and that sent me to a West Point prep school. At that time, the Air Force Academy was brand new. They didn't have their own prep school. So I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and then I got into the Air Force Academy that next year, and so I started in the summer of 1959, and I graduated in 1963.
How did you meet Grandma?
I met Grandma when I was a junior at the Air Force Academy, and I have to say I had been on confinements for getting in a little trouble, so I hadn't been out to see the real world for some months. So I went to swim. We had a big Olympic swimming pool at the Air Force Academy, and there was a some kind of swim meet going on down there. So I just went down to looking for people, and I saw Grandma, and I thought she's the one for me. So I wrote her a letter, but I misspelled her last name, so it took a while to catch up. But eventually we talked and we got together. The first meeting we had was going to church. I wasn't Catholic, but we went to Catholic Mass.
What type of training did you receive to learn how to fly a plane?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it takes almost a year in the military to become a pilot. Now you might wonder, well, what goes on during a whole year? So you have a lot to learn about the airplane itself, so that you can fly it by yourself, so that if something goes wrong, all the electrics, the hydraulics, the engine, all the things that can go wrong in an airplane possibly, even though these trainers, the first airplanes we flew were fairly simple to fly. But you spend a certain amount of time getting to the point where you can solo, where you can fly your own airplane. Then you solo and you can go out into the area and practice acrobatics in these airplanes. So you're doing rolls and loops and things like that. And this airplane could spin, so we do spins and recover from spins so that you would know how to handle those emergencies if you had them in flight. And then you would, about halfway through, we went from one airplane, a T-37, into a faster airplane called a T-33. So I flew that for about 6 months, and then you practice formation flying. And probably a biggest part of learning to fly is flying instruments, even though that part's not looked upon maybe with the degree that acrobatics and other things, but the ability to fly into a low ceiling and to take off and land in very low weather conditions with rain and all kinds of things that we encountered in Vietnam and Germany was an important skill, even though I was learning to fly in Texas and I don't even remember seeing a cloud. But we used to practice with a hood over our head so we couldn't see outside, and we would fly nothing but instruments.
What was it like to fly fighter planes?
So after I got my basic wings, became a pilot in the Air Force, and they give you your wings when you graduate. Then, depending on where you stand in your class, and I happen to be standing number 1 in my class, so when the airplanes came down for a given class, they give airplanes, like they'll give a couple fighters, a couple bombers, a couple transports, a couple this, a couple that. So whoever's number 1 in their class, they get to pick their airplane. So I knew I wanted to fly fighters, so when the time came to choose, there were only 2 F-100s in my whole class, so I took one of them, and the other guy who was right behind me, he took the other one. So then other guys were stuck with I guess, flying transports and other things like that. But it's probably just as well, because some of these guys maybe didn't have the skills that were going to be required to fly fighters. So once I had selected the F-100 as an airplane, then I went to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, which is nothing but a big fighter base. And the F-100 is, like most fighters, only have 1 seat. And most of these airplanes only had 1 engine, some of them had 2. They have ejection seats, things like that, but the ability to learn to fly, they only have a few 2-seaters. So in my case, I think I remember flying the first flight, they did have a 2-seater, so I had 1 flight in a 2-seated F-100 before I was taken off and on my own, where instructor pilot was on my wing following me. So we spent 6 months in what was called gunnery school. So you learn how to drop bombs, shoot the gun, do low levels. So we used to fly low levels over the Grand Canyon, when you could still do that. Probably can't do that today, but we would practice low level, and these were dead reckoning techniques where we didn't have the sophisticated electronics that we do today, so you could find your way around easily. We used time and distance and kept our airspeed right on and knew the heading and looked out and tried to find out where we were, and that's the way we stayed on track. So it was an important skill for me for later to some of the things I had to do in Vietnam, for example.
How many G's do you think, like, one of the, why can't I think of the words I want to say? On average, how many G's do you think you could, like, the planes could hold?
Well, the first fighters that I flew, the max G-force was 7 Gs. But the latter airplanes I flew, like the F-15 and the F-16 in particular, the F-16 was a 9G airplane. So 9 Gs, to give you an idea, if we're just sitting there at 1 G, so if your arm weighed, say, 10 pounds and you're pulling 9 Gs, now your arm weighs 90 pounds. So it really affects your body, and who knows what it does to your internal organs, but 9 Gs is not a pretty thing, but it is useful if you're in air-to-air combat and you need to get away. One of the things people don't realize is that we wear, on top of our flying suits, we wear G suits that inflate as we pull Gs, because the hardest part is to keep blood in your eyes, up in your head, so you can see, obviously, is an important part of being able to fly well. So, but your heart has a hard time pumping blood uphill when you're under high G loads. So as we pull more Gs, these G suits inflate, and they help squeeze the blood into our upper body and try to keep the blood in. And even the F-16 had a tilted seat back 25 degrees, and our feet were up a little bit higher, and that would give us a little more G tolerance. But you had to be careful. If you pulled too many Gs too quickly, you could black yourself out in flight.
Wow.
Were you ever afraid to fly?
No, I don't think so. Not really afraid that the airplane was going to do something bad. I had a few emergencies that were kind of difficult to deal with, and I almost got hit by a surface-to-air missile one time in Vietnam that knocked part of the tail off. So, but we were able to get it back on the ground because there was still enough flying airspeed. I had to land much faster than normal stuff, but no, I don't think I was really ever afraid in the airplanes. I kind of trusted the airplanes and I trusted my skills.
Did you ever have a fear of heights?
No, you don't experience heights in airplanes, amazing enough, because you don't go to the edge of a cliff like when I go to the edge of a diving board. Sometimes I'm afraid of that if it's high, but I never had those kind of feelings in an airplane because you're not standing on the edge of some cliff or anything.
What types of planes have you flown?
Okay, I've flown mostly fighters. I flew 4 different fighters. So I flew the F-100, which was a little fighter bomber. I flew the Phantom, which we got from the Navy, which it had 2 people in and 2 engines. And then I flew the F-15, which again was back to 2 engines but only 1 pilot. It was more or less an interceptor. I flew that in Germany during the Cold War, and we were patrolling the East German border. And then I flew the F-16, which is a little fighter bomber that we currently have in inventory, and it's quite an air-to-air airplane, but it carries a lot of bombs and has a lot of capability. It has a lot of advanced avionics and stuff.
Have you ever jumped out of a plane?
No, I'm happy to say.
How high up did you fly?
I've been over 50,000, probably 55,000 feet in F-15.
What was it like for you in Vietnam?
What was it like? The food was terrible, but there was a lot of flying, so again, it was something that we thought we were doing that was important to our country. So we went over there with a lot of enthusiasm. I was there from 1966 to 67. I probably flew better part of 200 missions in 365 days, so I was flying almost all the time, at least once a day, sometimes more than once a day. So we were pretty much just flying, eating, and there might have been some drinking going on as well. And we lived in pretty poor conditions. I wasn't living in a tent. I was living in an old French building that didn't have any air conditioning and everything. So when we were night flying, we could sleep in these trailers that were air conditioned, which we called the meat lockers. So you would go in there, it'd be really dark, all the windows are shaded over, you'd hunt around, try to find one of these bunks where there was nobody in there and get in there and get some sleep during the day if you were going to be night flying.
What did you do in Vietnam?
Okay, this was a fighter bomber, so I was pretty much the first year I was supporting the Army, the American Army. So whenever the Army would get themselves into trouble or whatever the missions we were given to try to stem the flow of the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese into South Vietnam, we were dropping bombs, shooting the gun, or protecting the Army, trying to help the Army out as they would get themselves into trouble at various times.
Very good. Have you ever flown any plane other than a fighter?
I flew a T-39 for a little while, which was a little jet transport. At one time I was a general's aide, and so he didn't care about flying, so I got checked out in the T-39, and I used to fly him around in the T-39. So it was a little twin engine, carried about 8 or 10 people. It's a pretty slick little airplane, almost like a fighter, pretty maneuverable and stuff. That was the only other airplane besides fighters that I flew.
What was your military career path?
My career path was to enter flight school and go to F-100 training, then to Vietnam. We were one of the first guys to go directly from training to Vietnam. Most of the other units had already been in their unit, then they would deploy the entire unit. But since I was a volunteer to go to Vietnam, which kind of ruined my reputation with some of my classmates at F-100 school because they all had assignments to Germany, and my assignment came down to go to Vietnam, and then all their assignments were changed to go to Vietnam. So some of the wives weren't too happy with me, but I was all prepared to go. So I was one of the first lieutenants to get to Vietnam as a guy fresh out of training. So it was kind of nice because the unit I joined, they had been there about 6 months. So they all went home at 6 months, and by that time I was even though I was still a lieutenant, I was a fairly senior, experienced combat pilot by then. So I could be a flight lead, which meant I led other fighters, So my career path was lieutenant, captain. I made captain when I was at Benoit. Then I picked up Grandma and the boys, and we moved to Lakenheath, England, where I was flying the F-100. But then we were sitting on nuke alert most of the time. So even in fighters, we carried small nuclear weapons, and probably if you had asked me what my most important contribution to American peace and history would be, that we didn't have the Cold War, because the Cold War was going to be ugly, because by the time we had dropped bombs in Japan, by the time us and the Russians were in a big arms race, we had developed nuclear weapons that were 100 times more dangerous and powerful. So if that war had ever cranked off, big cities like New York, LA, Chicago would have been just wiped off the map, and the rest of the people who didn't get killed in the blast would have probably wished they'd gotten killed because of radiation poisoning and everything. So while I was in Germany and sitting nuke alert, and then later in the F-15, we were keeping the Russians on their side of the fence, and luckily we never had that war. And I think that's probably the most important contribution I made to the defense of our country.
What military accomplishment are you most proud of?
Probably not crashing any of the fighters that I flew, and not having to jump out of them, and also protecting the American people while they were allowed to go about their daily business. We were on alert at Bitburg, for example, 5 minutes air defense alert. We could be in the air and on the way to the border. So the Russians knew that if they came across, we were going to be right there. So we kept them at bay until they finally ran out of money and the wall fell down in 1989.
Are you able to describe a situation where you felt the most fear?
most fear? Well, I don't know, maybe when I get in trouble with Grandma, I'd be afraid she was gonna take it out on me, so. I guess maybe one time when a pit bull was after me when I was a young boy and he grabbed me by the seat of the pants, lucky my dad came outside and saved me, so. I think I was pretty afraid during that, but I was never really afraid flying fighters. There were times in North Vietnam, particularly when the AAA and everything was heavy and guys were getting shot down. But I think you always, hope springs eternal and you think it won't happen to me, but I know it happened to some of my good friends, so I was sorry for that, but I knew it could happen to me as well.
What did it physically feel like to fly, like, zoom fast?
Surprisingly enough, the speed, except when you're really close to the ground, is not apparent in a fighter, even though most of these fighters would do twice the speed of sound, which is about 1,400 miles an hour. So I've been over 1,000 miles an hour many times in a fighter, but unless you're close to the ground, you don't really experience that speed. So it's more of maneuverability and the G loads that you're experiencing and the agility. These modern fighters are extremely agile in terms of their ability to roll, even if you know you're going to do a roll. And if I was sitting in the back seat and I warned you ahead of time, I could roll the airplane so fast it would bang your head off the side of the canopy. That's how fast they can roll and stuff.
Well, that kind of answers my next question, which is how fast do fighter planes fly?
Yeah, we kind of covered that.
Yes.
So most of them are Mach 2 airplanes. It takes a lot of power and excess energy to get past Mach 2. And quite honestly, we didn't use supersonic flight all that much in aerial combat and stuff because you could use it to accelerate, but usually by the time you started turning, the old fighters would lose speed and you'd be subsonic, which is less than Mach 1.
What special skills were you born with that you think helped you be a good fighter pilot?
That's a really good question because a lot of young guys ask me that from time to time, what should I be doing? And amazing enough, even though probably eye-hand coordination and playing sports helped out and being athletic, but when it comes to flying, amazing enough, you don't know how good you're going to be or not good until you fly, until you try it. There were guys who probably should have been good pilots who didn't do well in instruments, or they got vertigo in flight due to acrobatics and stuff. So it's not until you really start to experience flight and the G loads and the disorientation that can come with flying high performance airplanes that you realize that, hey, I have a natural skill for this that I probably didn't know I had. So when young guys ask me that, I tell them, well, you won't know whether you're going to be a good fighter pilot or not until you try it.
What skills do you have now as a result of being a fighter pilot?
Well, I was always pretty independent. There was probably a good reason I flew by myself because I prefer to do my own, be in control of my own situation. So I don't like riding in the back of airliners very much, as you might imagine. So, and of course my extremely great personality comes from being a fighter pilot because we were always kidding each other. So to be in the fighter community, you have to be able to take a lot of ribbing. So you develop a good sense of humor, hopefully. Do you see that in me?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you describe a typical day of, like, flight school?
Okay, I would get up and Grandma was always great about getting up, even though I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. She would fix me a very good breakfast because she didn't want me to go off flying without a good breakfast. We'd go into the little squadron ops, and I had my own instructor pilot, and there would be like 4 or 5 other pilots that were assigned to this one instructor. So we would spend some amount of time going over emergency procedures. So we'd go over those time and time again to make sure that if something happened while you're up there by yourself, you knew what to do. Then we would go over part of the tech order, which covers other parts of the airplane, how the hydraulics work and there. Then we would go off and fly a mission which I already knew from the night before what the mission was going to be, whether it was going to be acrobatics or instruments or whatever. So I would do that, we'd come back, land. Chances are we would have time for lunch, and then fly a second mission that afternoon.
Can you describe a typical day in Vietnam?
Typical day in Vietnam was get up. It was, like I said, these little cubicles we had in this old French building. We all lived side by side, and we had these beads on our little doorway, so to speak, and we had just a single bed and a wall locker. That was our total. So you get up, and we had a big gang shower in place, so everybody go down there, brush their teeth, do whatever they had to do, and we were all mixed in there together. We'd all head over to the officers club or the chow hall, mostly the officers club, have breakfast, and then head to the squadron and pretty much spend all day at the squadron, either flying or doing some duty at the squadron. For example, since I was the youngest lieutenant, when I showed up, they made me the snack bar officer. So that meant that I had to keep, and when I opened up the refrigerator, there was only one piece of bologna and a piece of cheese left in there from the previous guy. And so they wanted to be able to, they didn't want to have to go away from the flight line to eat. So luckily, right behind me, a good buddy of mine came in, and we invested some of our own money and created this fantastic snack bar out back of the squadron where we were cooking hamburgers and we were making money hand over fist. So once the squadron commander was afraid we were going to get him sent to jail because of all this, we got to work in squadron weapons, which is where I wanted to work, which was understanding the new bombs and everything that was coming on board, and briefing the other pilots about all that kind of stuff. So a standard day would go down there. Hopefully we had a certain number of stomach troubles in Vietnam. The food was pretty bad. We were trying to take malaria pills, which would make you upset stomach. So you would try to get that under control, fly, come back, and maybe fly a separate time. Sometimes we were pulling alert. So if we were on alert, we were stationed out at the end of the runway with about 6 or 8 airplanes. We were on 5-minute alert, and if the klaxon went off, we'd run out, jump in our airplanes, fire up and take off, and we didn't actually know what the mission was until we'd talk to the guys on the radio. And once a month, we'd do a night fly, which I hated that. It was dark. Vietnam was the darkest place I've ever been. So once a month, there were 4 squadrons there, so every squadron was rotating. So once a month, we would go on this whole week of night flying. So we didn't even go to work until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and fly 2 times at night, which that's probably, going back to the fear question, that's probably the only time you really get afraid, is all that night flying.
How old were you when you decided you wanted to join the military?
I must have been about 19 to 20.
How old were you when you got married?
I was 24.
What other jobs have you had, what other jobs have you had, or expert consulting have you been hired to perform as a result of your expertise as a fighter pilot?
That's a good question, even though maybe you didn't understand it too well. So as a result of my fighter experience, when it came time for me to retire, which I stayed in the military about 25 years. I could have stayed longer, but that seemed to be about right, because your dad and his brothers needed to go to school. I didn't have any money, so it was time to make some money. So I didn't want to be what was known as a consultant, where you just went to Washington, D.C. and you just took different parts of you took people, senior people from the company around to meet generals that you knew from being in the Air Force. So since I had an engineering degree already, and I had also a business degree from Stanford, I wanted to get a real job, so I went looking for a job at Lockheed or some other company like that. And so I had some contacts at Lockheed. So Lockheed hired me when I left the military in '85. And I was working in what's known as their skunk works, which is where they do all their black, highly secret programs. So the first program I worked on was the little stealth fighter. And I was able to bring a little bit of my engineering skills, but before I knew it, I was on an airplane to go back to Washington to introduce them to the generals and stuff like that. But the skunk works was pretty good because they allowed you to expand your own knowledge and do all the briefing. So a lot of times if I was briefing a concept, I didn't need another engineer or something. I could brief the engine, I could brief, so that was a good 10-year period that I worked for Lockheed. And so I worked on the Advanced TAC Fighter, which became the F-22, because I had F-15 experience. That was an airplane that was meant to replace the F-15. So I was able to help them out when they bid that airplane. And like I said, I worked on the Stealth Fighter and a lot of other classified projects.
What was your call sign as a fighter pilot? Oh, Blitz.
Blitz. Now that had kind of double connotations. Since we were based in Germany, it meant lightning. That's what the word blitz means. But if you ask a fighter pilot if he got blitzed on Friday night, he would say definitely, and he didn't mean that he was struck by lightning. He meant probably he had too much fire water.
What was your unit?
Oh, I was in multiple units. The one I was a squadron commander of was the Big 2-2, which I thought I had a plaque of that, but I don't know. So I was the squadron commander. It meant I had 24 airplanes, probably 32, 33 pilots, and all the maintenance guys worked for me. So I made sure I flew a lot, and that was probably the best job I had. We even had a mascot, which was a German hunting eagle. And the German word for eagle is Adler. So my call sign in the air was Adler 01.
I am out of questions.
So how about a big applause? So make sure you give her an A on this project.
That was terrific. You did a great job.
Right.
Those are really good questions.